Let's get a word firstly with David Elstein, former BBC executive producer and, of course, chair of Open Democracy, also head honcho over there at Channel 5. David, your CV is there for all to see. You know your way around a TV channel and a newsroom. What has gone wrong here? I mean, Deborah there saying, look, we're not institutionally biased, but that's certainly the accusation that's being put to them at the moment. Good afternoon to you.
Hi. It's slightly unfortunate because deep down she's right. There isn't some kind of embedded conspiracy inside the BBC. This is our agenda already and stuff. Unfortunately, the way the BBC recruits means that there's what we these days call groupthink, where people conform to the views of the people around them. And we know that this is true because there have been investigations in the past. Andrew Mair wrote an interesting report about bias in the BBC, and he just called it a general liberal bias. It was why the BBC was so unrepresentative of UK thinking over something like leaving the EU. And what the Prescott report assembled, and the chairman is quite right today to say that he's assembled it from internal reports within the BBC's editorial complaints process or editorial standards process, is what could be seen as a pattern of events. 5 or 6 different things where the BBC got its emphasis wrong on climate, on race, on Gaza, on Trump, and most recently on Martin Croxall. Well, that's after the event. And that looks like a pattern of behaviour. I suspect it's just lazy groupthink for the most part. And the great majority of BBC journalists are dead straight and do their job well. But the BBC is a very large organisation. It's really difficult to keep standards within it, and on this occasion they have failed not just once but half a dozen times.
Indeed, and of course, you know, it's difficult, isn't it? Because there are people on the left who think that the BBC... I mean, I remember Alistair Campbell losing his mind over Brexit, thinking, you know, this is the Brexit Broadcasting Company. He was perturbed by the amount of times Farage showed up on Question Time. But conversely to that, when I worked at the BBC, I mean, I remember working with a senior editor, David, who was incredibly sort of Corbynite kind of left-wing. You would never, ever know that through her work. She left it at the door. She was always absent. She was the most forthright person in the room at getting right-wing voices on to balance out what had gone on. And I think that probably does replicate what most journalists do. However, as you said, there's a sort of an underpinning. So I don't know, maybe we need a psychologist to get to the bottom of this sort of, as Mair said, this kind of liberal bias where perhaps things that would in any other place get checked, get a little bit of a free pass. And of course, when it becomes cumulative, and when you add it all up, you have this rather grim picture that we're looking at today.
Yeah, but what you've also got to look at here is thousands and thousands of hours of output every day and a few minutes that are then complained about or assembled into a dossier. Now, what the BBC did wrong in above all in this matter was it was so slow to respond publicly.
Yeah.
That dossier has been floating around for 5 or 6 months. When the Telegraph finally got hold of a copy last week, they should have known exactly what they wanted to say. Quite a bit of it is in Samir Shah's letter today. Too little, too late. And by the time he got round to writing that letter, he'd lost his chief executive and he'd lost his chief of news, and it was all entirely unnecessary. Back in May or June, all they had to do was say, oops, we've got this Panorama thing wrong, we're going to take it off air, correct the edit, put it back on, because broadly the programme's okay. We've got another half dozen issues, and we've set up a committee internally to deal with all of those one by one and check whether there's a pattern. End of. They didn't do it, and they're paying the price.
Absolutely. Can they get out of this? Can trust be regained at the BBC?
Well, look, I think David Turness is slightly exaggerating the point, saying the BBC is the most trusted media brand around. It's a bit more trusted than most, but not a lot. There's widespread disillusion with the BBC in a lot of age groups. It's not what it was. And restoring that trust, for me, in the end, comes back to an issue of accountability. Only when the BBC is truly accountable to its audiences, TV and radio, will its journalism, like its general output, finally lift itself out of the curse of the license fee. But as long as the BBC is not really accountable to anyone, not to you, not to me, not to the other license fee payers, not to the DCMS committee and Caroline Dedridge, not to the government, not even to Ofcom particularly, it's seen as a law unto itself, and that is not good for it.
Yeah, spot on. David, great to speak. Thank you, sir. David Elstein, former BBC executive producer, chair of Open Democracy. John Mair joins us, former BBC producer who's helped us out before on these kind of curious dilemmas for the BBC. I know you're a big supporter of the BBC, John. It was previously your home, work home, as it were. But this is a mess, isn't it? I mean, no matter how loyal you might be, this is a royal mess and a huge problem for the state broadcaster.
It's not state broadcaster for a start, Ian. It is a mess. But look, let's look beyond the headlines. Were Tim Davie and Deborah Turness stitched up? Were they stitched up by a group of right-wing governors who stopped them speaking? Apparently, they wanted to come out and speak last Tuesday, and they weren't allowed to. And it's only today that Samir Shah has said anything. So, this is a conspiracy, but, if Trump, Johnson, and the Telegraph are on one side, I'm on the other one, I'm afraid, on this one.
But aren't you sort of highlighting the problem there instinctively because the Telegraph said it, therefore I'm not going to believe them, but I'm going to believe what the BBC said, regardless of whether they're right or wrong. So that's bias, isn't it? You're biased, John, aren't you?
Telegraph has two stories every day about the BBC. One of them is...
And they did the same with the expenses, and thank goodness they did, because the BBC weren't there.
They did. But you have to ask, why did everybody take so long to react? David has just said, look, in May they had this report, they should have reacted then. And the Trump edit is indefensible. You can't defend that. That's just fraud. So they should have said, we made a mistake on this, and then appoint a committee for the other things. So, there's 5,000 or 6,000 journalists in the BBC, and they're not all dishonest. One or two of them. You've got Bashir coming down the track, by the way. There's a new book about Martin Bashir and Diana. Mm-hmm. That'll occupy you for the next week or two. And one thing I do believe is BBC Verify. They've made their own trap in that. It's such a silly idea. Yeah. Because what you're saying in BBC Verify is, look, this bit is true. The rest of the news is not true.
Yeah, but of course, when the BBC gets something wrong, it's writ large everywhere. It's in neon lights, it's in highlighter pen, it's all over the place. It might as well be in a billboard in Las Vegas. They are held to a certain standard, not just domestically but globally. And of course, with issues such as what is happening in the Middle East, over 200, I think, areas where they've had to correct themselves, BBC Arabic being at the centre of all of that. I mean, these are not just little issues. They sound like systemic problems in that area.
Look, I mean, the Middle East Gaza reporting, as far as I can see, the BBC has been pretty fair on Gaza. Remember, they're not allowed into Gaza, which is pretty disgusting. No international broadcasters allowed into Gaza, and they haven't kicked up a fuss about that. No, I mean, look, there's always two sides, and the Israeli propaganda machine is very, very, very good. They don't need a BBC. They've got their foreign minister and assistant foreign minister who comes on the telly and tells lies, and they've got Danny Cohen working for them here. This is an absolute minefield. And look, Tim Davie, of the last 4 or 5 director generals, 4 of them have been taken out of the building in a coffin, or having a coffin prepared for them. What a job! Who would take the job? Tim did it very well, but one thing is that it's going to end in failure, and you're going to end going out the door. only Mark Thompson is left with any glory.
We've just had this breaking news, John. Donald Trump threatening legal action against the BBC. He's confirmed the BBC have confirmed it has received a letter from the US president threatening a legal case. Of course, he's tried this in the US as well. What do you make of it?
I saw that, Ian. And Samir Shah got up 2 minutes before that and said, as far as I know, Donald Trump is not suing us. Now, where's the communication? Samir Shah was
obviously the chairman didn't know, but the BBC have now confirmed they've received a letter from Donald Trump.
By the way, let Trump sue, because that's what he's done in America. He shut people up by suing them. And that's his modus operandi. We don't work like that in this country, and somebody should tell him that.
How do the BBC regain trust, do you think, John? Because they've certainly lost it, whether you like it or not.
Well, it's a hard thing to regain. The way I always say it regains trust is to make good programs, true programs, which people want to watch. And when it's done, look at traitors, look at anything like that, away from the news. But where do you go when you want a big national event, when you want to know what's happening? You go to the BBC, and you go to BBC News. You don't come to talk, I'm afraid, Ian.
Well, you'd be surprised. Those numbers continue to grow. Listen, John, thank you. Nice to have you on, as ever. John Mair, former BBC producer, with his fairly defensive view on the BBC. I think something bigger, if you had to widen this out a bit, I think something bigger is going on. I think there is a distrust of news more generally, and the BBC is the more kind of prominent player in the pack. And there is clear, strong evidence that when the BBC have got it wrong, some of these are howlers. You can forgive somebody getting a name wrong, or an editor. Every now and again you're watching the news, and it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And there's somebody, a CEO of a big oil company, and the CEO starts speaking on the screen, and the strap, as they call it at the bottom, says Ryland Clark, presenter. And you think, that's not Ryland Clark. That's just an error in live news, OK? We all kind of forgive that. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about Panorama. The case of the Gaza kid, the Hamas relative who presented the documentary. I think, was that also Panorama, wasn't it? Was that another Panorama? I think it might have been. Either way, whatever it was, doesn't matter. These are big. These are big errors. They're glaring errors that it would have taken very senior people to deliberately ignore. That's what we're dealing with here.